We told ourselves we were being merciful. That is the lie I begin with, because it is the lie we all believed. The Galactic Council chamber was silent in the way only absolute power can be. No chaos, no dissent. Only the soft harmonic hum of 1,000 civilizations pretending they spoke with one voice. Light bent through crystal banners suspended above us, refracting into colors no human eye could ever perceive. To us it was beauty, order, balance made visible. And in that chamber, we erased humanity. They stood alone at the center dais, small, soft-bodied, breathing too loudly for a species-granted audience among the stars. Humans were always like that, too expressive, too emotional. Their faces betrayed every thought, every fear, every flicker of defiance. It made the elders uneasy. It made us feel exposed. The charges were read calmly. Volatility, aggression, uncontrolled adaptability. Words polished until they sounded reasonable. We spoke of stability, of precedent, of the dangers of a species that evolved too fast, questioned too much, refused to accept their assigned place in the cosmic hierarchy. Humans had challenged trade restrictions, challenged border laws, challenged us. So we challenged their right to remain. The vote passed without ceremony. Hyperspace lanes were revoked, trade codes invalidated, council protections withdrawn. In a single session, humanity was transformed from a member species into an anomaly, cast beyond the borders of shared space, legally untouchable, politically erased. I remember thinking how quiet they were. No screaming, no pleas, no threats. Their ambassador, a male, if I recall correctly, stood perfectly still as the verdict echoed through the chamber. His heart rate spiked, our sensors caught that, but his posture never wavered. He listened, he absorbed, he endured. From my species' perspective, it was an ending, a necessary one.
History was clear. Civilizations denied resources, allies, and safe transit collapsed within generations. Isolation was a slow death, but a clean one, preferable to war. Humans, we believed, would fracture. Their worlds were harsh, their colonies scattered, their technology inelegant, over-engineered, loud. They relied too much on redundancy, too much on brute force solutions. Fragile bodies held together by stubborn will and chemical defiance. Without the Council's guidance, without shared infrastructure, they would turn on each other. History told us so. As the session concluded, human fleets began withdrawing from shared systems. We observed from a distance, academic, detached. Data streams replaced concern. Charts replaced empathy. The models predicted famine, political collapse, internal conflict within 50 cycles. I archived the file under resolved threats. And yet, even then, something felt wrong. Human communications did not diminish after exile. They intensified. Our long-range arrays detected bursts of transmission flooding into the void, music distorted by distance, voices layered with emotion so raw it disrupted translation matrices, speeches, oaths, calls for unity broadcast across light years. Where other species retreated inward when abandoned, humans reached outward. They did not mourn quietly. They raged. They organized. They adapted. I remember a junior analyst noting the anomaly, suggesting increased surveillance. The elders dismissed it. Emotional noise, they said. The final sparks of a dying culture often burn brightest before extinguishing. I wanted to believe that. Then came the moment I cannot erase from memory. As the human delegation prepared to leave the chamber, tradition demanded a gesture of submission, a bow acknowledging the Council's authority even in exile. Every species complied. Every species understood the ritual's importance. The human envoy did not bow.
He looked up instead, meeting the gaze of beings who had watched stars be born and die. His expression was calm, not angry, not broken, resolved. Through the translation field, his voice carried clearly. "You'll hear from us again. No threats, no curses, just certainty." Laughter rippled through the chamber, amused clicks, harmonic chuckles, dismissive silence. The idea was absurd. What could a species stripped of allies, resources, and access possibly become? I laughed too.
That is another truth I record. At the time, humanity was a footnote, a problem solved through procedure and patience. The galaxy returned to equilibrium. Trade resumed, borders stabilized. But as the human ships vanished into uncharted space, their transponders darkening one by one, I felt something unfamiliar coil within my core, a sensation my species had no precise word for. Not fear, not guilt, recognition. Because when a species accepts exile without begging, when it leaves not in despair but in silence and resolve, it is not ending, it is preparing. We sealed the borders behind them, confident we had preserved peace. We did not yet understand the cost of underestimating a species that treats survival as a promise rather than a hope. And as the chamber lights dimmed and the council moved on to lesser matters, one final human transmission slipped through our sensors, too weak to translate, too fragmented to decode. Only later would we realize what it was. A beginning. Silence is not unusual in the galaxy. Stars burn quietly, civilizations rise and fall with little more than statistical residue. Even extinction has a rhythm. Panic, collapse, noise, then absence. We have cataloged it across millennia. Dying species scream as they fall, flooding space with distress calls and desperate migrations. Humanity did none of this. After their exile, their territory went dark. No trade vessels crossed former human corridors, no diplomatic probes petitioned for mercy,
no refugee convoys bled into neighboring systems. Their communication bands, once chaotic with argument and emotion, collapsed into nothing. The Council recorded this silence as confirmation of our decision. Extinction delayed, the elders said. Inevitable. I should have agreed. The data supported them. Without hyperspace access, human supply chains should have failed within decades. Without trade, their resource-poor colonies should have starved. Without allies, their internal divisions should have ignited into civil war. History told us so. Yet I could not stop watching the void they left behind. It was not empty in the way dead space usually is. There were no drifting hulks, no emergency beacons looping endlessly into static, no radiation scars from orbital bombardment or reactor meltdowns. It was orderly. Too orderly. Even the stars seemed wrong. Stellar flares where there should have been none. Gravity wells bending at unnatural angles. Regions where sensors refused to resolve clean images, as if reality itself resisted observation. When I requested reconnaissance, the Council approved it with mild amusement. Let the archivist chase ghosts, they said. Let the record show thoroughness. The first scout probe returned corrupted, not destroyed, altered. Its memory core contained impossible readings, mass fluctuations without visible objects, power signatures with no corresponding emissions, debris fields arranged in symmetrical patterns. This was not the aftermath of collapse. It was infrastructure. A second probe vanished entirely. The third returned images that unsettled even hardened analysts, vast skeletal frames hidden within stellar flares, megastructures using stars as camouflage, shipyards embedded in asteroid storms where sensor noise masked construction, stations anchored inside crushed gravity wells that would have torn our vessels apart. Humans had not retreated to safety. They had retreated into danger. Where my species required stable orbits and harmonic environments, humans embraced extremes. Radiation fields became power sources, dead stars became anchors, chaos became concealment. They were not surviving, they were preparing. I compiled my findings into a formal report and presented it to the Council. I remember the reaction clearly, the polite stillness, the faint hum of shared skepticism. Humans lack unity, an elder replied. Their own history proves it. Violence, fragmentation, endless internal conflict. Without external structure, they will destroy themselves. Others agreed. They reminded me that adaptability without restraint leads to self-annihilation, that emotional species burn out quickly, that exile merely accelerated the inevitable. They ordered the border classified as low-priority observation, so I watched alone. Years passed, then decades. The silence persisted, but it evolved. Subspace echoes rippled where no ships were detected.
Long-range arrays caught brief distortions, as if something massive slipped between dimensions and sealed the wound behind it. Occasionally, human-coded signals flickered and vanished before translation could lock on. Not messages, tests. What unsettled me most was what didn't happen. There were no internal human conflicts spilling into neighboring space, no splinter factions begging for asylum, no breakaway colonies seeking council favor. Against every precedent, humanity remained quiet, unified. That should have terrified us. Instead, the council grew complacent. Border defenses were reassigned, patrol routes shortened, human space became a footnote in navigational databases, a dead zone to be avoided, not feared. Until the outpost went silent. It was one of our oldest listening stations, positioned along a former human trade corridor. Hardened against stellar storms, redundant power cores, autonomous defense grids, it had endured 3 wars and a supernova shockwave without failure.
Then, without warning, it vanished from the network. No explosion, no energy spike, no distress signal. Just absence. A recovery team was dispatched, more irritated than alarmed. Equipment malfunction, they assumed. Aging hardware finally giving way. When the team arrived, the station was still there, intact. No hull breaches, no signs of battle, no bodies. Every system had been shut down simultaneously, cleanly, as if powered off by its creators. Data cores wiped, defense grids disassembled, and stacked neatly in the docking bay. On the central command console, one fragment of data remained, a single transmission loop, encoded in human frequencies. We translated it at once. This space is no longer yours. No declaration of war, no demand for negotiation, no signature. Just a statement of fact. As the words echoed through the council chamber, I felt the same sensation I had felt during humanity's exile, the tightening, the recognition. Silence had never meant extinction. It had meant restraint. And now, the quiet beyond our borders was beginning to speak. The first human fleet did not announce itself. It arrived. No herald signals, no ceremonial broadcasts. One moment, the border system was empty, cold stars, predictable orbits, familiar patrol routes. The next, space folded inward, and something vast tore through reality with controlled violence. Our sensors screamed. What emerged was not the humanity we remembered. The ships were wrong. Gone were the rounded hulls and mismatched plating we once mocked as inefficient. These vessels were brutal, angular frames layered in modular armor, surfaces scarred and blackened as if they had already survived wars we never witnessed. No decorative illumination traced their edges, no cultural insignia marked allegiance, only function, only intent. They moved with terrifying coordination, sliding into formation without a single collision warning or course correction. It was as if the fleet shared one mind.
They did not transmit a request for reinstatement. They did not demand apology for exile. They issued a declaration. This territory is sovereign human space. Not a plea, not a threat, a statement of reality. As more fleets emerged, dozens then hundreds, the scale of our error became impossible to ignore. Human space, once a scattering of fragile colonies, had transformed into something unified and deliberate. Independent governments no longer argued across light years. Borders no longer fractured authority. Exile had done what centuries of negotiation never could. It had forged them. Through intercepted data and fragmented observations, we began to understand the structure of their empire. It was not centralized in the way ours was. There were no towering capitals demanding obedience. Instead, human systems operated like living organisms, distributed, redundant, adaptive. Every ship was a weapon and a shelter. Every fleet was an armada and an evacuation force. Civilian modules were embedded deep within warships, shielded by layers of armor and contingency fields. Human soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to rebuild power grids, habitats, even ecosystems. Where we saw destruction, humans planned recovery. They had turned suffering into infrastructure. The first border engagement shattered our remaining illusions. We deployed a defensive flotilla, standard doctrine, overwhelming firepower meant to deter escalation. The humans did not retreat. They did not charge blindly either. They tested us. They sacrificed 3 ships to map our weapon response times. Sacrificed. The word still tastes wrong, but it is the only accurate one. Those vessels did not attempt evasive maneuvers. They absorbed our volleys, transmitted telemetry until the final moment, and detonated with precision that disrupted our targeting arrays. The rest of the human fleet adjusted instantly. Within minutes, our formations were obsolete.
They exploited weaknesses we did not know existed, angles our simulations never considered, frequencies our shields were never tuned to counter. When we altered tactics mid-battle, they adapted faster. When we withdrew, they pursued just far enough to gather data, then disengaged. They were not trying to win that battle. They were learning. In the aftermath, Council analysts assured us this was unsustainable. Casualties would demoralize any species. Losses would fracture unity. Humans were still biological, still finite. They were wrong. Each subsequent encounter followed the same pattern. Humans would probe, absorb losses, retreat, and return altered. New armor configurations, new weapon harmonics, new doctrines that rendered our previous counters irrelevant. Where other species feared casualties, humans accepted them as cost. Where we mourned losses as failure, humans treated them as instruction. I reviewed intercepted human communications during this period. I expected despair, rage, political fracture. Instead, I found resolve. Messages of remembrance woven directly into tactical updates. Fallen crews honored not with silence, but with purpose. Their data ensuring the next fleet survived. Their deaths were not endings. They were investments. As human territory expanded, so did their influence. Fringe species, those long exploited or ignored by the Council, began aligning with them, not through conquest, but protection. Human fleets escorted refugee convoys. Human engineers stabilized failing worlds. They did not rule through fear. They ruled through reliability. Watching this unfold, I felt something close to shame. We had believed comfort was the foundation of civilization, that stability bred wisdom, that harmony produced strength. Humans proved the opposite. They were shaped by hardship, tempered by loss, united not by ideology, but by shared survival. Their empire was not born of ambition. It was born of necessity.
And necessity, I was learning, is far more dangerous. The Council convened emergency sessions, voices raised in a chamber that had not heard panic in centuries. Some called for total war, others for negotiation. A few, too few, acknowledged the truth. We had not exiled the weak species. We had removed the constraints holding them back. As human fleets pushed deeper into contested space, their formations tightening, their strategies evolving in real time, I watched a projection update across the chamber, a probability curve I had never seen before. Human victory likelihood rising, not slowly, exponentially. Then came the transmission that ended all remaining debate. A human signal, broadcast openly across contested systems, translated into every known language. We did not build this empire to conquer you. We built it so no one could ever erase us again. Behind the words, sensor feeds showed something vast moving within human-controlled space, structures mobilizing, fleets assembling at a scale we had not anticipated. They were no longer testing. They were preparing to advance. And for the first time since I took my seat among the Council, I understood a terrible certainty. We were not facing a rebellion. We were witnessing the arrival of a civilization forged by exile, one that would not stop until the galaxy acknowledged the cost of underestimating humanity. The war did not begin with fire. That was our first miscalculation. There was no grand invasion, no massed fleets crossing borders in defiance of our treaties, no declaration issued to the Council chambers, no ultimatum broadcast across the stars. For a time, it almost seemed as though humanity had paused, had chosen restraint after proving its strength. Then our supply lines began to disappear. Not attacked, removed. Convoys failed to arrive at staging systems. Fuel depots went dark without explosions. Communications relays fell silent one by one, their last transmissions perfectly intact until the final moment. Then, nothing. Human fleets struck with surgical precision, dismantling the skeleton of our war machine while leaving its body untouched. They avoided our population centers entirely. At first, we mistook this for mercy. It was strategy. Without supplies, our fleet stalled. Without relays, our admirals fought blind. Without coordination, entire armadas became isolated clusters of power, impressive on paper and useless in reality. By the time we attempted retaliation, the humans were already gone, vanished into folds of space our charts had never accounted for. our war models collapsed within weeks. Every simulation assumed predictable escalation: probe, counter, decisive engagement. Humans rejected this logic entirely. They did not advance in straight lines. They appeared at impossible angles, emerging from stellar coronas where no sane species would navigate. They used stars themselves as weapons, timing attacks with solar flares that blinded our sensors and overloaded our shields. They turned debris into artillery. Wreckage fields became kinetic minefields, accelerated with frightening precision. Asteroid belts shifted under human influence, transformed into moving barriers that crushed pursuing fleets against gravity wells. Where we saw hazards, humans saw tools. And always, they learned. In one engagement, we adapted our shields to counter their primary weapon frequency. The next encounter, their weapons had changed. When we reinforced armor against kinetic impacts, they introduced harmonic resonance attacks that tore ships apart from within. Every loss we inflicted refined them. They sacrificed ships, not recklessly, but deliberately. Vessels would charge into our formations, broadcasting every impact, every failure, every microsecond of data before destruction. The moment one fell, the rest of the fleet adjusted.
By the time we understood their tactics, those tactics were already obsolete. But tactics were not what frightened us most. It was their morale. Human soldiers fought knowing they might not return, and went anyway. Our species value preservation. Survival of the individual strengthens the whole. Casualties weaken resolve. That is the foundation of our doctrine. Humans inverted it. Their unity was not ideological, not enforced through hierarchy or fear. It was emotional, a bond forged through shared loss, shared memory, shared refusal to vanish quietly. Each fallen human did not fracture morale. It hardened it. I witnessed this firsthand during an interrogation I will never forget. A human officer had been captured after his vessel was disabled, not destroyed, merely rendered inert. He was injured, bleeding internally by human standards, yet he refused sedation. He sat upright, eyes unfocused but alert, watching us with calm defiance. I asked him why they continued fighting. I reminded him of our numerical superiority, our technological legacy, our ancient alliances. I asked why his species did not seek negotiation while survival was still possible. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said simply, "Because giving up means extinction." No hatred, no dramatics, just truth. For humans, surrender was not an alternative outcome, it was annihilation delayed. That realization spread through the council like a slow toxin. Species that had once voted confidently for exile now begged for ceasefires. Delegations that had dismissed humanity as unstable petitioned for emergency negotiations. The irony was suffocating. We had taught them the lesson ourselves. As our strongest fleets fell, not in glorious battles, but in fragmented, humiliating defeats, panic replaced order. Admirals contradicted each other. Elders argue openly in chambers once defined by harmony. Emergency doctrines were rewritten daily, then discarded just as quickly. Nothing worked. Humanity did not slow.
They accelerated. Each victory expanded their operational range. Each liberated system became a staging ground, its people fiercely loyal to their human protectors. Fringe species joined them, not because they were forced, but because humans stayed when the Council never had. Human fleets arrived first. Human engineers followed. Human soldiers rebuilt defenses, power grids, habitats. They did not extract tribute. They extracted loyalty. By the time the Council authorized total mobilization, it was already too late. Our forces were exhausted, scattered, reactive. The humans, by contrast, moved with terrifying cohesion. Every strike seemed to anticipate our response before we made it. As I reviewed the latest projections, one figure stood out above all others. Human operational adaptability. Unbounded. No ceiling, no saturation point. They were not fighting to win territory. They were fighting to ensure no one could ever decide their fate again. Then came the message that confirmed our worst fears. A human broadcast, transmitted openly across all contested systems, layered with visual feeds of liberated worlds and dismantled Council fleets. We learned how you fight. Now you will learn how we endure. Behind the message, sensors detected massive fleet movements, coordinated across dozens of systems. converging not on border worlds, but toward the very heart of Council space. For the first time, the unthinkable was spoken aloud in the chamber. The war was no longer about the fence. Humanity was advancing, and this time they were not disappearing after the strike. They were coming to end the system that had exiled them. It began not with fire, but with silence. The human fleets arrived at the capital system like a storm that waits at the horizon, vast, ordered, inexorable. Thousands of vessels, each scarred from battles we never knew existed, formed a perfect lattice around the core planets. Their presence alone froze our defensive protocols. Not a single shot was fired. Not a warning flare, not a signal of intent. They merely were. And then they reminded us of our own failures. Within hours, the planetary shields, technology we had trusted for centuries, flickered and collapsed. Defense grids were breached, not by brute force, but through calculation, precision, and an understanding of our networks no one had anticipated. Subspace channels carried transmissions we had assumed private, and through them, human engineers broadcast our own council deliberations back to us, holographic recordings of the vote that had exiled their species centuries before. Every argument, every gesture of dismissal, every self-assured whisper of superiority projected across the stars. They wanted us to remember. The assault began, but not in the way history would record it. Council defense platforms did not explode. They fell, silent and precise, deactivated and dismantled from within. Our oldest warships, relics of ancient conflicts, were boarded by human forces. No annihilation, no waste. They took our vessels as witnesses. They preserved our stories. I watched from the observation chamber as the council convened for emergency action. Panic had never sounded like this before, voices raised in disbelief, the harmonic resonance of fear vibrating through crystal conduits. Our models failed. Every scenario collapsed in the face of human ingenuity. And yet, even as our fleets fell and our worlds were encircled, there was no cruelty. Not genocide, not humiliation, not pillage. Instead, there was correction. Human soldiers moved with restraint, disabling systems rather than destroying them. Colonies were liberated as they passed, infrastructure stabilized rather than stripped. Even in victory, they offered survival. Their power was absolute, but their will was measured. Then the council chamber itself caught fire, not from weapons, but from systems deliberately overloaded, automated defenses redirected against themselves.
Flames licked crystalline banners and the floors of polished alloys, melting centuries of authority into smoke. I could hear the hum of panic rising in the chamber, and yet, through the inferno, I recognized something extraordinary. Humanity had surpassed us not merely in technology, but morally. Their purpose was not vengeance, it was accountability. They were teaching us a lesson we had thought we understood, but had never truly grasped. A voice, crisp and transmitted across all frequencies, echoed through the solar system. We were cast out, we adapted, we endured. This is the cost of underestimating us. For the first time in recorded history, the Galactic Council surrendered. A silence followed, not the quiet of a concurrent species, but the stunned stillness of civilizations finally recognizing something beyond comprehension. I recorded every moment, every transmission, every fallen warship, every liberated colony, every terrified elder. The galaxy had changed. And at the center of it all, humanity remained, unbroken, unbowed, and impossibly, irrevocably alive. After the fires of the council burned, we waited for the inevitable. Occupations, tribunals, subjugation, retribution. Every projection, every historical model we had built predicted one outcome. Humanity would claim dominion over those who had cast them out. We were wrong. When the human fleets entered the core systems, their banners did not proclaim conquest. Their soldiers did not enforce law with gunfire. They moved with authority, but not arrogance. And then slowly, they spoke. Terms were offered. Not surrender terms, not ultimatums. Terms for coexistence. The council itself was dismantled, not replaced, not absorbed. The human fleets oversaw its deconstruction, removing bureaucracies, restructuring governance,
eliminating the monopoly of power that had allowed the exiling of an entire species. Decisions would no longer rest in the hands of a distant, insulated elite.
In place of the council, humanity proposed a federation, not a hierarchy, not an empire, a network of mutual defense, shared hardship, and adaptive governance. Every species equal under the law, every planet with a voice. Exile could no longer be wielded without consequence. The lessons of humanity's survival were now codified into policy. Disregard, and you risk isolation. Not obliteration, but the mirror of what humanity had endured. Many refused. Some clung to old pride, clung to the illusion of superiority. They were not destroyed. They were isolated, cut off, left to contend with themselves in exile. The lesson was unmistakable, clear as the silence that had once surrounded humanity. No species may judge another without risk. Humanity's empire was no longer just a sword. It had become a shield, not to dominate, but to protect, not to conquer, but to endure. Survival, they demonstrated, was a shared responsibility, a covenant rather than a command. I watched from my station as systems once unaligned pledged allegiance, not out of fear, but respect. Human fleets patrolled borders, rebuilt devastated colonies, and offered guidance to those willing to receive it. Their strength inspired loyalty rather than obedience. When the offer was extended to me and my species, I hesitated, not from fear, not from pride, but from comprehension. I accepted, not because I had no choice, because I finally understood. Humanity's survival was not an act of defiance, it was a revelation. And in accepting their terms, I joined the galaxy in learning the most important truth. Strength exists to protect, not to dominate. Today, the galaxy remembers humanity not as conquerors, but as architects. Architects of a harsher, yet fairer cosmos, one tempered by the lessons of exile, sharpened by the fires of loss, and illuminated by the resilience of a species that refused to yield.
Where once civilizations measured power by fleets, resources, and bureaucracy, now they measure it by endurance, adaptability, and unity. Humanity transformed exile into evolution. Every hardship, every battlefield, every loss became a foundation for the next advance. What the Council once perceived as chaos, recklessness, and stubbornness, we now recognize as method, strategy, and inevitability. Fear became purpose, suffering became instruction, weakness became the teacher of strength. Other species watch. They study human history, not as a cautionary tale to frighten children, not as a saga of rebellion to whisper in council halls, but as a blueprint. Adapt or fade, stand together or fall alone. Strategic doctrines have been rewritten. Schools teach the human campaigns alongside the rise and fall of stars. Engineers replicate their modular vessels. Sociologists analyze their social bonds. Philosophers debate the moral calculus of survival that humanity exemplified. As one who once voted to exile them, I write this with the weight of memory and shame. I record it for the species who may follow, for those who might forget, and for those who still underestimate what it means to endure. Humans are not special because they are strongest. They are not special because they wield the deadliest fleets or the most advanced technologies. They are special because they refuse to stop. No matter the pain, no matter the loss, no matter the universe itself. We tried to erase them. We believed we had stripped them of their future. We were wrong. Instead, we forged them. And now, as I gaze upon a galaxy subtly, irrevocably altered, I know this truth. Humanity will endure, and all who stand against them must reckon with the consequences of underestimating what cannot be broken, only tempered.